Today, excuse me, we're going to talk about Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's first two stages of grief. This will probably be a shorter lecture than some of the other ones, but we're just covering these two stages for this week, and we'll get into the other three stages next week. I may add a lecture for Wednesday on euthanasia from James Rachel's. We'll see, but for now, we'll just cover these two stages, and we'll go from there. So let's get clear first about what exactly the stages of grief are supposed to be, right? So at bottom, these are coping mechanisms that are used by people to face their own death. So the five stages are sometimes called the 5 stages of dying, 5 stages of grief, but 5 stages of grief can make it seem like, it's supposed to be about any sort of grief. So if I lose my dog, I have a dog since a puppy and 11 years, and then later the dog gets cancer and dies, let's say. Sad, very sad, right? And I would grieve, but it's not really, at least not originally, supposed to apply to situations like that. It's more supposed to be about how people who are facing their own death grieve, and the coping mechanisms that they use. And then later, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, and some others of her followers try to apply this more generally to people that have lost, like a dog or a family member, or have gone through trauma. They're trying to face that. But that's only later. Originally, it was just these coping mechanisms that people who are dying tend to use. Okay. Now, the evidence that she uses to develop this model is precisely that, right? It's about people who are dying and the way in which they experience that death. Okay, terminal patients facing their own mortality, right? And then only later do we get this applying to like people who are, family members, I should say, family members of the dying, going through these stages, sometimes mirroring the stages of the person who's dying. When they're angry, the family member's angry. When they're denying, the clinicians and the family members are denying. But originally, it's just people facing their own death and how they experience it. Okay, and the stages are not meant to be really strict. It's not like, okay, everyone goes through these and they go through them in this order. No, she acknowledges that people jump around. They might deny and then accept and then bargain and then deny and then get angry and then deny again and then get depressed and then accept and then deny again. And some people even skip stages. Right? So you don't even have to go through all of the stages, really. She accepts both of those things. She's just like, this is kind of a general, common way in which people tend to address their own death and tend to cope with it. They're contingent, right? It's not necessary that you go through them in this order. They tend to have a certain ordering, but it's very common for people to skip around like this. So that's the general idea, okay? It's not strict. The focus is how dying people cope with their own death. All right, so what's the first stage? Denial and isolation is the first stage. And this comes from her first two chapters really, where she talks about our natural attitudes towards death. We naturally fear death. Right? We naturally get defensive towards death. We naturally deny death. We naturally push death towards the outskirts. And so our initial reaction to the reality of our own death in a case of being like a terminal patient, right? Not just realizing, hey, I'm mortal, but no, when you realize I have a disease, the doctors told me I'm going to die fairly soon. That sort of recognition of your own imminent death, the initial reaction to that is to deny that it's real, right? Because we do this already, right? This is already our attitude towards death, that we try to subtly or unconsciously kind of deny it. And so then we take up this attitude when it faces us, when it comes right up against our face. This can't be true. You must have mixed up my charts. You must have mixed up the names. Something's wrong here. There must be a mistake. You got the wrong person, right? Can't be me. And what Elisabeth Kubler-Ross thinks is happening is that this is acting as like a buffer. It gives you space and time between the reality of your death and the reality that you thought you knew, that you were alive and going to be continuing to live, right? It puts a buffer between those things so that you can try to muster up some more helpful defenses, right? Some more helpful coping mechanisms. But people go in and out of denial because we can't really hang on to the truth of our death. That is, we can't really hold on to the acceptance of our real imminent death for forever, for very long even, because it's hard. But we also can't deny forever because obviously it's right in front of us. We're in the hospital, the doctors are treating us, and so on. And she thinks we should embrace this. When people deny, try to allow them their denial. When dying people are denying their death, try to allow them that, and it helps them cope with it, right? When they're ready, right? Allow them their bouts of denial when we can, as much as we can, really, she would say. And then, this will help them be able to address these psychological feelings, not feel like they're doing something wrong by denying, right? And that will make it easier for them to eventually accept if we can allow them their bouts of slipping back to like, oh, this can't be true, or whatever it is. Not letting it get in the way, though, right? And one way to do this is to address death early, as opposed to later when you're just talking about prognosis, how long you have to live, and the extent of the terminal illness you have, or even whether it's terminal, right? Diagnosis stage. But going in for an exam, for tests, if you initially think something's wrong, even in checkups, right? Talking about these kinds of things, the potential, like, oh, you're at this certain age where people tend to get these things. Make sure you're doing this and that to take care of yourself so that you're, avoiding this risk of having this terrible, maybe terminal illness. Talking about that stuff early gets it in people's minds, and it helps them reduce denial and be able to accept their death later if that comes up. You don't want that to be a shock, right? Shock is a good recipe for denial. Right? So denial is normal, and she does think we should allow that, but too much can be problematic. So, right, there's this idea of breaking down the denial that she talks about. So talking about the disease, talking about the treatment, having doctors in there running tests, talking about your options, having family and lawyers and so on in there talking about arranging your affairs, what you're going to do, or I should say what you want to happen to your belongings, your money, whatever, your family. That makes the death really real, right? So talking about these things and performing sort of ordinary procedures while you're in the hospital or in hospice, that breaks down the denial, right? And so that can be a good thing when you need to sort of help them come to acceptance, but it can also be a way in which denial is going to, when they have denial, it's going to resist these kinds of things, talking about these kinds of things, right? And that can be bad because it can disrupt their treatment, right? And if they're in denial and talking about these things, going through the treatment sort of breaks the denial down, there's going to be a lot more resistance to that. Because this is just going to bring, going through the stages of the treatment and all that is going to bring their death and the mortality to the forefront. And if they're in denial, they're going to be resistant to that. And it's a way in which it can lead to resisting the actual treatment that they need. So we have to be very careful there's not too much denial, right? All right, so isolation tends to come at the end. So denial is saying, hey, this is not really real, you got the wrong person. Isolation is more about keeping keeping that reality of your death and your mortality, your imminent death, keeping it at the outskirts, just like we do normally and in society. Push it to the outskirts. Keep the living at the forefront. Right? So denial is pretty rare at the end. I think she says like 3 out of the 200 plus interviews that they did, only 3 people really were in kind of significant denial towards the end. But isolation is more about physically isolating yourself, not letting the nurses and doctors come see you, not letting your family come see you, because maybe you've accepted it, but now that's really upsetting and you want to isolate yourself so you don't have to actually face and talk about it, right? And then psychologically, isolating it to the back of your mind, focusing on, the continued hope and the good things. Yeah, so isolation, a little different, but even after acceptance, you can still isolate yourself, which can kind of reinforce this sort of denial to stick around. Now, how do we identify and address the denial? Well, all this is basically going to come down to talk to your patient, Learn about your patient. Right? That's at least a significant key component. So learn to look for signs of readiness in your patient, in the person that's dying, right? And use that to adjust your behavior, right? So she talks about this. The patients will act kind of the way that the people around them will act. So if and vice versa. So if the patient's in denial, it's going to be a lot easier to and isolation can be easy to accommodate as well. But being in denial can be easy to accommodate because we are afraid of our own deaths and addressing death, she says. And so if the patient's in denial, we're going to feed right into that and deny as well. And if they're angry, we're going to be angry. Right? There's this kind of give and take. And so learning to look for signs of their readiness and not just going off the way that you feel, whether you're ready, right? Because they're going to adjust to you. And so you need to be aware, right? And be aware of the patient. You have to learn about them, right? So it's not always good to just destroy their denial either, she thinks. She actually thinks we should reinforce it as much as we can. Not reinforce it. Sorry, I read this. And we should embrace their denial as much as we can without jeopardizing their treatment. Right? So let them have their denial as much as it makes sense to do so, as much as it's practically viable, because it's just easing their psychological stress and emotional stress, but making sure we enforce the doctor's orders, right? The treatment plan. And she even suggests like lying or telling half-truths. Encourage taking medication and so on, following the diet. It's like, oh, this is what you need to do if you want to make it home. If you ever want to eventually make it back and be with your family or whatever, you're going to have to be well. And so you need to take the medication and do this stuff, right? So almost like do the little lying or half-truths for the kind of greater good, right? So it's not always good to just meet the denial head on. Respecting denial, she thinks, can also be a respect for the patient's autonomy and their dignity. Let them have their denial if it's not hurting anyone. Right? As long as you're working towards keeping the medication and the treatment plan, don't deny the doctor's orders, don't deny the science or whatever, but respect their autonomy, respect the need that sometimes they just want to ignore their death for a minute, right? And then again, just be aware of our own defensiveness towards death, right? How can they be so deluded? Having these kinds of signs we're putting off can make it reinforce their denial, their isolation, right? And if we're, just this part here, if we're not able to accept our own death, it's going to be really, really hard for us to help the patients accept their own death. Okay. So again, just denial is the first reaction because this is our natural reaction towards death anyways. And then when our death becomes imminent, it's, of course, we're going to think, wait, there must be some mistake here. And then she wants to say part of the way in which to cope with denial is to think about our own denial of death and to deal with that. And that's and to get to know our patient. Those two big things. Deal with our own defensiveness towards death so that we're not putting that off on the patient and acting in ways that make it worse, right? We can embrace it. We can allow ourselves to talk about it, bring it to the forefront if we need to help them accept it. And we can't do that if we don't accept our own death. But we also have to know our patients because people are going to be in denial and address denial differently. And the same thing will happen with anger. Okay, so the second stage is anger. Once we accept our death, once we get over, it can't be me. Can't do that forever. Then we shift to, damn it, well, why me? Why me rather than someone else? Right? So, denial gives way to anger and associated feelings like rage, envy, resentment, and these last two directed at the living, the people who get to live on, right? And even when we're kind of over the denial, we basically accept the fact of our death, we still kind of deny that it's fair, right? We go from, it can't be me, to, okay, it's me, but why me? It's not my time. I have so much more life left. Like, this isn't fair. This isn't just. So there's still a kind of denial that persists. And then anger can often be harder to deal with than denial, because denial doesn't really project in the same way as anger. Denial is a kind of suppression, right? You want to hide, you want to ignore, right? But anger comes out. When you're denying, you're like, no, like, I don't want to talk about it. You just focus on other stuff. And especially when you're denying death, and the sad thing, you want to focus on living and being happy, or what your family's doing. You just want to focus on the living parts, right? But anger, that's not a suppression of something. That's a sort of outward emotion at something. I don't like this. And it often, just naturally with humans, it often just comes out. When you're angry, it comes out at other people. And then in particular, as Kubler-Ross suggests, it comes out in this way. It's like nothing's ever right. Nobody's ever doing anything right. The nurses are wrong or whatever. Or not wrong. They're not treating me right. They're ignoring me too much. And then when they're paying attention to you, they're overwhelming me too much. Your family members, like, oh, they're not getting my affairs in order. They're not paying attention to me, or they're like overwhelming me by coming too much, and they're not giving me my space. So no one's ever doing anything right. Okay? But this kind of anger at the living, right? Just like jealous, kind of envious, these people that get to live on. It comes out that way because it feels unfair that you're dying. And it's very, very natural for us to respond to anger with anger, especially in these kinds of cases where the family members, the nurses, doctors, at least by and large, most of the time, I'm guessing, they haven't done anything. It's not like their fault, the patient's dying. It's not really anyone's fault, right? Usually. It's like just sucks. I mean, you just got an illness, and that's just the fact we've discovered. And the doctors didn't create it, at least in the normal cases, right? Set aside kind of weird cases. And the family members didn't do anything. But this is where the anger gets directed. And because of that, it's very easy for people to feel defensive. Like, look, I didn't do anything. Why are you angry at me? And even if you're not consciously thinking about it, right? It's just very natural, instinctive. Even if the patient's not like outwardly criticizing you or something, they're just being, passive aggressive or whatever else, it's easy to return that kind of attitude. And that, of course, just makes things worse, right? All right. Now, she also thinks we should understand the origin of anger as a means towards addressing it. And so how do we address grief? Denial. We talked about that above. What do we do in addressing anger? Well, one of the most important things is understanding where the anger is coming from. So where it's coming from, they're not really angry at anything you did. They're angry at that they're dying, right? They're angry that their future plans, their future life was interrupted. That's kind of what's going on. Right? Taking it personal is just going to make it worse. You're going to want to avoid, it's going to create tension, it's going to make things combative. And so understanding that the patient's not really angry at anything you did, they're just angry at their plight, at their situation. That's super important first step. Right? And a key to this, and a key to addressing anger in these patients in general, is again addressing our own death. If we're afraid of death, we're going to deny, we're going to isolate from the patient because we don't want to face their death because it's uncomfortable for us. But accepting that allows us to understand the patient and where they're coming from, and makes this easier to do. Or understanding this, right? That they're not really angry at you. That's going to take accepting what it's like to face death. And that's going to take thinking about death, thinking about our own death and what it might be like, and putting ourselves in their shoes. How would you feel? Right? You have to kind of imagine you were dying to understand how they were feeling. right? That's tough, but we need to do that in order to understand the patient, where their anger is coming from, and then how to address it. And again, she's very much on understanding your patient. Talk to them, listen to them, look for signs and strengths in their background and what their family members have to say. This is where she talks about the businessman, the wealthy businessman who controlled everything always, but then obviously can't control the fact that he's going to die. And so that's part of where the anger was coming from. And of course, this is going to be true for everyone, but understanding these things can help address particular patients and their particular needs and the particular sources of their feelings, their anger, their denial, right? And then we can use these to cope with the anger, to help them cope with the anger, and to reduce our own tendencies to exacerbate that anger by either getting angry back or isolating, avoiding. And then this Sister I interview, which takes up the bulk of chapter 2, kind of just showed, I mean, one of the main upshots of that was just, it was really helpful for her to just sit down and talk to them about this stuff, right? Because, I mean, it's helpful for them because they could see where the source of her anger was coming from. She talked about her family and her parents and her relationship with them and lots of other things, but it just helped figure out where the source of the anger was coming from. And now people who have to deal with that with the patient's psychological states head on, like a chaplain, minister, or like a psychologist or a counselor, knowing the source of that anger is super important. And that just came out just from sitting down and talking to them and listening, right? And then letting Sister I vent just made her feel better. Just getting heard helped, right? And then it provided a means for going forward, because then you could see where these little things come out, like the little things that the nurses were doing that were irritating her, that weren't so bad, and maybe she didn't even realize until she sat down and talked to them about this, that those were things that were contributing to her anger and upsettedness, like, you know, I don't know, I can't remember what they were, but exactly, but things like the following, just making this up, this is not from the Sister I example, but it was things like this: closing the blinds in the hospital room so you can't see out into the hallway. Can feel like maybe it would make them feel isolated, right? And maybe nobody's even really noticing that, not even the patient, sort of in the moment, you know, but then they just feel more saddened, more depressed, more angered, whatever. And then sitting down and talking about these things can kind of pull that stuff out and be like, oh, okay, yeah, well, what kinds of things make you feel this way? And then they have a chance to think about it, and they say like, oh, okay, well, you know, when the nurses come by in the evenings and close the blinds or whatever, it just kind of made me. And then it's just little things. Maybe that's not for everybody, but some people. And then that just allowing this listening allows little things like that to come out, so you can see the kinds of little adjustments that are available to do, right? That you can do easily, that might just help these little situations from being overblown when they don't need to be. So again, the 5 stages, quick little recap. The 5 stages are supposed to be focused on coping mechanisms for people facing their own death. And only later did they try to apply them more generally, and we'll talk about that, this model in general. So the stages aren't strict either, right? As we said, you don't have to go through all of them. People actually skip around more often than going through them straight in order. So that's important to keep in mind, especially when we get to this last section. This first stage denial, of course, this comes from our natural denial of death and defensiveness. And then when your death is imminent, it just comes right out. You hit it head on. No, this can't be true, right? And then how to deal with that denial, embracing the denial, but not letting it get sort of too much to where it's interrupting the treatment. And then, of course, understanding your patient's going to be one of the best ways to understand how to address their denial and help them through it. But also, you can't really do this. Where is it? Oh, you can't really do this if you haven't accepted your own death, because it's going to just make you much more prone to want to avoid and not talk about it and not face it and be awkward even. Right. And the same thing for anger with this stuff, getting to know your patient, accepting your own mortality. These are really important steps, she thinks, towards dealing with all of the stages, all of the emotions. But anger can be particularly difficult because it sort of projects more and in a different way than denial. And it's really easy for us to meet anger with anger, especially when we are justifiably feeling blameless. Like, this person's mad at me, they're putting anger towards me, but I'm blameless, I didn't do anything. That's going to make us more defensive and more prone to get angry back. So anger is difficult to deal with, but understanding the source. They're not mad at you, they're mad at their death. That's going to require us to think about what it would be like to face our own death. So again, addressing our own death is key. And then again, like, understanding your patient is going to be important, because not everyone gets angry because they're not in control, right? Not everyone gets angry because they have unresolved issues that they think they're not going to get to address. It's going to differ for different people, so understanding that person is important. Okay, so let's look at some criticisms. So we're going to look at the next 3 stages next week, but I want to highlight this just to have it sort of in the back of our minds as we're working through the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross stuff, that this model has some issues. So there's not a whole lot of empirical work, first of all. It's the evidence that she originally had was just these interviews, just anecdotes. So these are not controlled scientific studies. She just went around and interviewed. This is more like what's called exploratory research, where you're not really testing a hypothesis. You don't have a control group. You're just kind of collecting data and then seeing what you get. And then taking that data and trying to tell a story, making a theory or a model, trying to tell a story that makes sense of that data. That's all good and well. That's just not a controlled scientific study. The scientific study would be after that, where you take this model that you think explains the data you have, and then going and testing it, collecting more data, and then manipulating different factors to see if your model holds up. That's more of the scientific part, right? And it's just had little support. So this kind of goes together, these 3 here. Some studies have been done to see what kinds of coping mechanisms people use when they face their own death, when they face trauma, when they face loss. And it's just, I mean, at best, it's inconclusive that the 5 stages model works. Maybe a little support for it, but there's also contrary findings that that's not really what people do. And, it's missing key things like resilience is a big thing that people tend to use, kind of a coping mechanism. And the 5 stages model doesn't account for that. So the point is, the original work, not scientific studies, just qualitative interviews, anecdotes, basically, that they tried to tell a cohesive story about with this model. And the studies just haven't really shown that it's a scientifically sort of valid or scientifically validated theory. It just doesn't have a whole lot of scientific empirical support. There's also, this is a big one, there's no underlying theory that unifies everything. So again, it's not like they had a hypothesis or a theory and then went and tested it. They just collected, they were like, what's it like to die? What do people experience? That's interesting. Let's go ask them. And then they just got a bunch of interviews and probably observational data that they recorded, like, oh, patient does this, patient X does this, patient Y does this on this day in this circumstance. Just a bunch of observational data, and then tried to tell a story about it. Okay, that's not really science. That's part of science. It's the beginning of science. Like, of course, you go observe and you collect data, and then you try to explain it, but it wasn't controlled. Okay, so we have no idea about how all these different factors play in. How does the environment, the culture, the socioeconomic status, different psychological dispositions, maybe different mental disorders that are comorbid with their terminal illness. What explains why the stages are, why people go through the stages when they do, in the order that they do? Why do people skip ones when they skip them? Why do other people not skip those stages? Why do people in the same situation with the same illness go through the stages differently? There's just nothing to explain this. Nothing about the model explains any of this. There's no theories about this. There's no principles about this. Nothing about how the different factors... There's just so many variables going on here and none of them were controlled for or tested. That's what we mean when we say it's not a controlled study. You just go collect some information, and you're not really controlling whether different influences that you might not be paying attention to are affecting the kind of data that you're getting. Okay? And it's because there was no pre-existing underlying theory about this. There was no hypothesis or theory that was being tested that would tell you, like, give you an idea about how to set up the experiments and how to control these different factors and what to test for. You're just kind of throwing a big ass net out there and seeing what you get, and then seeing if you can write up a story, a model that can consistently explain the data. Well, we found out that it seems like there's a few different theories that can explain the data, and this model doesn't actually explain all the data in the same kind of way, right? There's sometimes we do studies and you get some contrary findings where it doesn't really match this model, right? So there is empirical work missing with the 5 stages model, to say the least. So the potential for negative implications is also there. So if this model, if you're not careful about this stuff, about the stuff that it's missing, people can think that it's prescriptive. It's like, this is what you should be going through when you're dying, right? If you're not careful about that, the fact that it's not really well supported empirically, and it's not supposed to be prescriptive, it's not telling you how you should be grieving. If you're not careful about that, then people can think that they're grieving wrong. The patient, the clinicians can think their patients are grieving wrong, so you have to be very careful with that. And this is not to say that her work is like useless or terrible or something. It's just to say that we have to be very careful because this is not a scientifically validated theory. It didn't come from controlled studies. It's not really clear that it's supported by controlled studies later on. But it is important for teaching us to be really mindful of the patient experience, okay, and what goes into the difficulties. This fear of death, our own fear of death, getting to know our patients, the obstacles of modern medicine and modern technology that make it hard to focus on the patient experience. That's really important stuff. But we just need to keep this stuff in mind. These criticisms here. We need to keep them in mind. Okay, so let's wrap up. Keep in mind the stages of grief, what they are. It's not grief for everyone at all times. It's really supposed to be about the grief from the perspective of a dying person. Okay. And it's not even meant to be a strict process. It's allowed that you don't follow them in order sometimes. Sometimes you don't even go through certain stages. That's allowed. Right? So keep that in mind. It's part of what causes these worries here, but keep that in mind. She's explicit about that. And then keep in mind what she means by the 2 different stages. Denial, anger, the difference between denial and isolation, right? And remember the source of denial from the first couple chapters. What's the role of a fear of our own death in the patient's denial? How can it exacerbate it? How can it make us not deal with it, right? And then what's important for addressing denial? Getting to know your patient, addressing our own death. Same for anger. Right, but why is anger worse? How does denial still play a role? Even if you've accepted your death, what might you still be denying? Right? And then addressing anger, understanding where it comes from can be really helpful. But that requires us getting in sort of to the head or the shoes of the dying person. And again, addressing our own death, which is also important. Okay. And then lastly, again, keep in mind these criticisms, right? That it's not really supported by empirical work. I mean, it's not like, oh, we found conclusive evidence that the 5 stages are wrong. It's not like that. It's just there's not really good evidence that this is a model that sort of works rigorously in the way that a scientific theory would be supported to work, right? It's like it's a general kind of thing that's maybe true of some people and maybe not true of other people. That's not really a scientific theory about what happens when you go through the dying process. That's like as good as saying, well, some people experience this stuff, and so look out for it. Okay, I mean, that can be helpful, for sure. But the evidence is anecdotal. It's not controlled studies, right? There's current research doesn't really show that it's well supported. Are there really any underlying theories that can tie the model together, that can tie how the model applies together, why people go through some stages and some don't? why they go through in one order and some another order. And this kind of leads to, is this model even falsifiable? Could we find evidence that would show that it's false? And if we can't, I mean, how scientific really can the theory be? Again, not to say that it doesn't have helpful upshots, right? Reading and analyzing like literature can help us understand how to deal with a patient sometimes. So, and that's not scientific, right? So it's not like you can't find useful things in this theory, in this work that she's done, and in her book. It's just, you have to keep this distinction between helpful literature and scientific research. So just keep that in mind. All right, so next week we'll talk about the three other stages, the third, fourth, and fifth stage of grief that she talks about, which is, so this is denial and anger this time, and then it goes to bargaining, and then depression, and then acceptance. So we'll talk about those. I may put up I don't know if I said this at the beginning, but I may put up a lecture for Wednesday on euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide. Well, actually on active and passive euthanasia from James Rachel's. Possibly, we'll see. But for now, that'll be it. Thanks.